She was principal at SK Capital Associates, and she has over 15 years of experience in real estate finance. Prior to SK Capital, she was a senior banker at JP Morgan, where she was responsible for all different facets of wealth management. And prior to JP Morgan, she worked at Lehman Brothers for over 8 years, where she was instrumental in Lehman Brothers real estate investments in the Asia markets. In addition, Ms. Kim has been involved as a real estate attorney at Paul Hastings, and prior to becoming an attorney, she received her JD at the Illinois Institute of Technology, the Chicago College of Law, and she received her BA in Legal Studies from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. So please welcome Ms. Kim.
Thank you all for joining us, and thanks for the intro, Rebecca, and thank you, Professor Forrester, for really just putting together an extremely, just an inspiring group of women in real estate. And one of the things that we were talking about before is how, and I don't know if it was planned or not, and it could have been planned by all you all, but how we all have different perspectives on real estate development. And so before we begin, I would like to give you, a brief background. And I was telling these women that, their distinguished careers, they have so many interesting experience and projects that they worked on that I had to actually shorten a little bit. So I'd like to start by introducing you to Meredith Kane, who's sitting to my left. And Meredith is a partner. She's a lawyer at the law firm of Paul Weiss in New York. And she is a partner in the real estate department. And she represents developers, equity investors, institutional entrepreneurial owners, and government agencies in all aspects of development, finance, acquisitions, sales, equity, JVs, restructuring, leasing, securitization of real estate.
Did I really list all of those?
You sure did, but that's, it all plays into it. And just to highlight, because we could spend about 30 minutes on all of their projects, but just to highlight and give you an idea of some of Meredith's projects that she's been involved with. She was involved in the long-term lease acquisition of New York's World Trade Center complex, the development of MTA's 26-acre Hudson Yards, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard about, the Atlantic Yards in Brooklyn. She also represented the Stuytown Peter Cooper Village Tenants Association, and the transaction between the City of New York and Cornell University and Technion Israel Institute of Technologies, otherwise known as Cornell New York Tech. And again, we could go on and on your other projects, but we'll move on to our next. So welcome, Meredith.
Thank you.
So our second distinguished woman in real estate is Eileen Weingarten, and she is the Vice President in Design and Construction of the Forest City Ratner Companies in New York. Eileen has over 13 years of experience. She has been Forest City's, she's been responsible for the 463-room Embassy Suites Hotel in Battery Park City, the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York, and various aspects of the recently completed Barclays Center Arena and the surrounding 23-acre Atlantic Yards development project. Prior to joining Forest City, Eileen worked for Gordon Associates as an owner's representative in charge of several buildings and master planning projects for Long Island University. She also previously worked as a project manager for Kohn, Pederson, Fox Associates for 8 years. She's also a Cornell graduate, as you all may know, and so please welcome Eileen.
Thank you.
Ms. Jill Lerner. Jill is a principal at Kohn, Pederson, Fox and Associates, one of the world's most respected and innovative architectural design firms in the world. At KPF, she leads institutional practice in the design of award-winning academic and research facilities projects throughout the United States and abroad as well. She's been an architect with over 35 years of experience, and she's committed to design excellence in all aspects of her work. And some of her major projects have been NYU Shanghai, the Peking University School of Transnational Law in Shenzhen, the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, the Ross School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania, the Seminole Institute of UCLA, and CUNY's Advanced Science Research Center. Jill has also extensive involvement at Cornell. She taught professional practice to architecture students at Cornell's New York City program for 5 years and advised the 2009 Solar Decathlon team. And other board roles include Asian University for Women and New York Salvadori Center, and she's also a member of the New York Building Congress. And after 9/11, Jill co-chaired the Memorials Process Committee for New York and New Visions. So welcome, Jill, please. Okay, so the way I like to start this panel is, a lot of, sitting from your perspective, you look at the bios of these women and you have to wonder, we didn't all get here in a vacuum, right? So a lot of our paths was not linear, and we've taken many positions and we've had experiences throughout our lives and our careers that have really shaped who we are today. So the first question that I'd like to ask all three of you is, how did you get to the position that you are in today? And if anything inspired you or shaped your views on your career or your interest in real estate development, architecture, or the law. And by the way, there's no order in which these women will answer, so feel free.
Great. Sure, I'll be happy to jump in. First of all, Shu, thank you very much. I also want to say we had a wonderful lunch beforehand, and I know talked to a number of you who are in the audience, including hearing about how people got interested in real estate and started in real estate. Because I think real estate is one of those areas that is unique enough that you really need to have a passion for it. And that's what really I think everybody who's in real estate has in common. There's something they love about the built environment. There's something they love about the tactility of it, the act of creating something, the act of creating urban space. I fell into it purely by accident. I graduated from college with a degree in philosophy. I kicked around for a while, unemployed. I met somebody who happened to work for the New Haven, Connecticut City Planning Department when I needed a job. I sent my resume in. I'd taken one class in urban planning as an undergraduate. That was really my sole credential for the job. And I got this job, and I loved the subject matter. I found myself completely engrossed in looking at the life of this older industrial city and what problems was it having, how did it need to be redeveloped, and really beginning to get involved in the nuts and bolts of what could government do, how could government work with the private businesses that were in New Haven, what kind of planning tools and economic development tools could be put into effect. So after I did that for a couple of years, I knew I loved the subject matter. I knew that this was an area I wanted to work in. And then the question for me was, well, how best then to work in that area? Because I think that when you start, as all of you did with working before going to school, the question is, how do you pursue real estate after that? So I thought, well, I didn't think about architecture school. I knew I wasn't talented enough for that. But I did think I either could go to urban planning graduate school, I could go to business school, and I thought I could go to law school. And I'm not totally sure why I picked law school, but it turned out it actually was a very good choice for me because I went to law school. I knew I wanted to do real estate law. And what I wanted to do was focus on really the structuring of deals. Well, you guys haven't been to law school, but when you get to law school, you realize it's actually nothing about real estate at all. They never teach you about real estate. So I got there, and it was really a couple of years of trying to figure out why am I studying about what they're doing in 15th century law courts. Well, suffice it to say, by the time you're done and you get into the practice of law and the practice of real estate law, it was everything that I hoped it would be. So I've been at my law firm ever since I graduated from law school, with the exception of 3 years. And I just want to emphasize this because I think that this is sort of an important idea of kind of how careers can take off. I never intended to be a law firm partner and stay work in a large law firm for my entire career. But, so after 3 years, I decided I'd learned enough, I'd learned a lot, steep learning curve, it was great, and now time to go off and do what I really wanted to do, which at that point was really to get back into urban development and particularly affordable housing. So I left my law firm and went to work for the city of New York, running some of their affordable housing programs. This was back in the 1980s when Ed Koch was really ramping up housing programs in the city. And it was a real eye-opener. It was a great learning experience. I have to say I didn't love working for city government at all, but what it did do was created a knowledge of the way that city government works and a set of lifelong connections that when I finally decided, to go back to the law firm and go back to the same law firm I had left and continue on working as a lawyer, I brought new skills, new knowledge, new contacts that I think probably served to take me farther in my career than simply staying in one job would have done.
And of course,
enough about me.
Being a lawyer, though, I haven't been involved in one transaction in real estate that a lawyer was not involved, and not only involved, but a critical aspect of a transaction.
Well, I know we're going to get to those questions, but the fun part really about being a real estate lawyer is that your job is to figure out how to structure the deal,
yes,
and how to bring in all the interests and how to bring in the money and how to resolve the issues that everybody has that will enable everybody to figure out how to work together and create something that will be a lasting good.
Very good.
Thank you, very interesting. I graduated from architecture in 1976, and I always wanted to be an architect. And when we graduated that year, there were absolutely no jobs. But I was fortunate enough to find a job with Kohn, Pederson, Fox in January. So I was out of work from May till January. I thought it was an eternity, but it was just a blink of an eye when you look back at it. So I worked for Kohn, Pederson, Fox for about 8 years, and Kohn, Pederson, Fox has some of the best designers in the country. I think at one time we had 4 or 5 Rome Prize winners. There was no way I was going to be able to do design. I wasn't the best designer here at Cornell, but I found my niche. I was really good at managing. I started to go out into the field, and I realized I loved going out into the field. I didn't do the design, but I got the design built. I defended the design. I talked to the contractors and the construction managers and the engineers, and I found that I was very good at it. So I advanced very quickly into a project management role. So I was there for about 8 years, as I said, and I decided to branch out into small consulting firms that did owners representative work. And what owners reps do is they represent people like Long Island University who don't have in-house construction and design expertise, but need somebody on their side to help them with big projects. So I worked for 2 small owners rep companies, and in 1999 I started working for Forest City. So I became a project manager, owners representative for Forest City on its own projects. And again, most of my work was working with the finance people, the deal makers, the lawyers in my office, the developers, using my expertise in design and construction to advise them in the projects they were getting into, mostly schedule, budget, constructability, helping choose the team, and so on. And then also going out into the field and following the projects all the way through construction. So I did that on a couple of projects. The Embassy Suites was my first one. And then in 2003, they asked me to work on the Atlantic Yards project. It's a 23-acre urban development project in downtown Brooklyn on a site that was a bus, an old bus graveyard, a storage yard for the Long Island Railroad. It had some abandoned buildings and very poor quality buildings, some residential, but most of it was in distress. And we worked from 2003 until 2007 just putting the project together, going through more than 30 lawsuits, working with the state to get their help in with eminent domain mainly to assemble the land, buying up quite a few properties on our own, going through 2 different architects, a master plan, a lot of infrastructure, moving a railroad, building a new subway station, sewer, water, you name it. And I was part of a little bit of everything. In the end, my last couple of responsibilities were the infrastructure and food service. So and that was my favorite. We have the best food in the NBA. So if you ever come by, I'll see if I can get you a fish taco or something. So yeah, I've covered all bases on the Atlantic Yards project. And I didn't get here, I never thought I would be doing sewer work. I never thought I'd be doing food service installation, but every step of the way there was something in the economy, something in the office, vacancy in the office. Eileen, can you help out here? And I just kind of felt my way around and took on whatever they had. And so I've had quite a varied experience, but everything has been great.
So I've had a pretty straight line career, I think. I went to Cornell architecture and graduated as an architect and loved architecture from the minute I set foot in the studio, and I loved everything about it. I loved actually all my classes. I liked the technical stuff, I liked the theoretical stuff, I loved the design stuff, I liked drawing, I liked writing, I liked the whole package. And I've always been an architect, so I've had a very straight line career in that sense. But when I graduated, I got married shortly out of school to my husband, who also went to Cornell architecture, and he then decided to go to business school. So I spent the first 8 years of my career really moving from place to place. We moved to Philadelphia while he was in business school. We moved to Chicago. I worked for different firms in Chicago, and I worked for small firms. I worked for big firms. I worked for Helmut Jahn in Chicago. I worked for Richard Solomon, who ran the Graham Foundation. I worked for a whole variety of kinds of places. And then when I was 30, we moved back to New York. And all those experiences had taught me that I really loved working on large projects, that I really loved the scale at which you could make a difference, whether it was at a university building or a research center or an urban plan or a large major civic building. I really liked working at a large scale, and I liked the team aspect of working in a big firm where there were lots of people who were really smart and were real experts in their field, and there was so much you could learn from all of them. And so I really felt at that point I had to stay with a firm for a longer period of time, because the kinds of projects I liked took really a long time to execute, as you've heard. And so, you know, some of my projects take 8 years, 10 years till they the complexity of the deal is worked through. There's many iterations. They stop for the economy, then they start again a year later. You know, people lose funding, they get funding. Universities, they, you know, put holds on construction, and then somebody gives a big donation. So, you know, it takes a long time to see these projects through from start to finish. But at any rate, I came back to New York, and I worked for a number of firms, and then I joined KPF 19 years ago in 1994, and which actually Eileen had left at the time, but it's the same firm, Kohn, Pederson, Fox, and they didn't really hire senior people, but I had 17 years of experience. And the reason that their base, and they had been really hurt in the recession in the early 90s. They had to lay off 100 people, and they didn't want to go through that again. So they hired me, and we really believe in growing people from the ground up. So, you know, I'm still considered a newcomer, even though I've been there 19 years, because all the other principals have pretty much been there a lot longer. So even young people younger than me have been there a very long time. So it's, it was great, because I was able to build an entire practice within a practice. And, you know, KPF was already very established, very well established, and, but I really grew there, and helped them diversify their economy into this new area. So it was really terrific, and now we have a great portfolio of a real set of mixed-use buildings, and it's, while it's still the minority of KPF's work, It really has put us into new areas. It's put us in touch with new people, new clients, and so forth. I think the single biggest turn in my career became when I became a principal. And when I became a principal in 1999, one of the other principals said to me, the best thing about being a principal at KPF is it gives you a platform. And from that platform, you can then go on and do whatever you want to do in life, whatever your interest is. And I didn't really understand the power of that statement. But what that meant was when I came to my Cornell reunion, and I had not set foot on the campus in 23 years at that point, actually it was my husband's reunion, I came back, and the dean at the time knew I was a partner at KPF, and I was the only woman partner, and he said, would you join my advisory committee? And that was my first step outside the business world into doing anything what I would say is extracurricular. And those extracurricular involvements, my involvement at Cornell, my involvement in the Asian University for Women, now I'm the president of the AIA, all those involvements have given me a much bigger platform on which to talk about issues that I think are important, that my firm has, the experiences my firm has led me to. We've done a lot of international work, we practice around the world. All those experiences have been really broadened by the extracurricular participation. And I think that has been the biggest turn in my career, was shifting from being totally focused on my job to being able to use that to leverage a more outward-looking focus.
Yeah, that's actually really critical, what you just said, because I think that's very much true for me as well. And I guess I should answer the question.
You should. Yes, please do.
And so how did I get to the position I'm in today? And I actually run my own company. And so it's not every day that the firm that you work for goes bankrupt. And so when I was at Lehman, it basically forced me out. And one of the things that people ask me often, after I left in May of 2008, I started an internet company, and a lot of times people ask me, why did you leave your core competency, which is real estate finance? Because I was a real estate finance attorney, and then I launched Lehman's Asia Global Real Estate Group in Seoul, South Korea. And then when I went back to New York, and things were not looking so great at the time, I always wanted to start my own business. And when I left in May of 2008 and launched my internet business, I think the real transition or the pinnacle moment for me was when I left the practice of law and I was mandated with my own P&L to start basically a business that didn't exist for Lehman, albeit I had Lehman behind me, but it was really at its very nascent stage in Korea. And I was held with the responsibility of basically building that business from nothing. So I was I wore the HR hat, I was general counsel, we were promulgating laws, I was meeting with the Ministry of Finance, and I mean, there's no way that I would have been able to do that or have that experience in the States, right? Because everything is so structured, right? So when I left Korea and I came back to New York, I realized that I really missed the creativity, that entrepreneurial sort of, here's what I need you to do, you figure it out, that aspect of it. Feel very confined. So I think that experience of being sort of entrepreneurial in Korea allowed me to kind of step back when Lehman went bankrupt to say, what do I really want to do? And at that point, I felt like I had the experience and the network, and things were pretty slow in 2009, 2010, but I realized in 2011, private equity was slowly, I could hear it coming back. I would go into the city and meet with my former colleagues, and they were all they were coming out of hibernation, and they all landed jobs in various hedge funds and private equity funds and family offices and endowments and pension funds. And at the same time, the operators and developers that had survived the market downturn, were all kind of coming back, and there was sort of a little bit of a shift because 2 or 3 years had elapsed. A lot of the debt providers used to be the investment banks. Lehman provided a lot of debt, and all of a sudden, construction debt just dried up completely. And so then the regional banks took over, and they started providing debt to these local operator developers. And so I saw an opportunity where, wow, there's really a need to advise these operator developers after the market downturn, and while I thought, you know, at the time, private equity market and the real estate market was really coming back, and really connecting them to the right capital source. And by that I mean, you know, it all depends on, you know, who the operator developers are, right? I mean, some people need different amounts of equity, and, you know, different partners provide different structures and different relationships. One thing that I think all three of you would agree is, more than ever today, relationships really matter. I think more than anything. Right?
Yes, I mean, that actually is probably the mantra that I hear most often.
I completely believe that.
And interestingly enough, you know, looking at that issue from a lawyer's perspective as well, you know, the lawyer's job is to write the documents that are, you know, create the joint ventures and create the long-term relationships, whether they're landlord-tenant relationships, whether they're borrower-lender relationships, but just create the long-term relationships by which the parties are going to live. And if things fall apart, by which the parties are then going to exercise their remedies and figure out who has a right to what. And the lawyers all say that at the end, and the clients all say, at the end of the deal and the end of the negotiations, when the deal closes and you actually fund the deal and start the relationship, you want to put those documents away and never look at them again. Because it's all about the relationship, and it's all about picking the right partner, and you never want to be able to look at those documents again, you know, and exercise your remedies. So yes, that is the most important thing, I think.
I agree.
The only time you look at a contract is if you have a problem you can't talk out.
Yeah. I mean, that's what most of my operator developers always say. And I said, you know, I like to introduce you to X fund or Y fund. The first thing they say to me is, Shu, let me just explain to you what I'm looking for in a capital partner. And that you know, probably wasn't as important pre-2008, but it is today, because it's really important, like for the same reasons, you know, that you just mentioned.
It is. And of course, you know, in capital sources too, and that I mean, this really gets into very much the structure of the equity markets. And the types of investors that are out there, that you know, exactly, that's changed too. And you've got all different kinds of equity parties that have really got different objectives. Some are long-term investors. Some are funds that have got a limited life, and they've got to be in and they've got to be out again within 5 years within the life of the fund. You've got some that are IRR driven. You've got, you know, exactly. So depending on the type of project you're doing, your match with a capital source, and Shu, this is, I think, you know, what you do.
I call myself
really
a matchmaker, by the way.
and that's right.
All right, great, excellent. So the next question is, if you had to do it all over again, would you have done anything differently during your college career?
Me? You know, every once in a while I think, well, I'm not really an architect anymore. Maybe I should have gone to business school. Maybe I should have done this or that. But at the end of the day, no, I think what I did was fine. I could have studied harder, but then I wouldn't have had as much fun. I think I met a lot of great people here. I liked the path of my career. I think it was great for me.
Well, for me, I always tell Cornell students, because I used to interview students, high school students, when they were applying to Cornell, and they always have asked me, well, is there anything, you know, that you wish you had done while you were there? And the only thing I ever say is I never spent a summer in Ithaca. And I think that's what, I think the whole place changes in the summer. I get that sense, and so that's
good advice.
It's a small thing, but in terms of bigger things, the only thing I really regret is that I never went to grad school. By having a 5-year undergraduate professional degree, I really never had to go to grad school to be an architect, to be practicing, to really do anything I wanted to do. But there was a point in time when I was living in Chicago, actually, and somebody wanted me to teach, and I didn't have a master's degree, and they said, I'm sorry, you can't teach. And fortunately, when I was, you know, much older then and much more accomplished in my career, and the former dean of architecture and planning, Weiss and Mustafavi, said, well, I really want you to teach in the New York City program that we're forming. And I said, but I don't have a master's degree. And he said, oh, forget it. You're teaching professional practice. You've been practicing for all these years. You don't need it. So, you know, then it didn't really matter. But I think in 2020 hindsight, I look at there are quite a number in my firm who come come and then they have great degrees from great undergraduate schools, and then they do go back to grad school, and I think it adds a different perspective on the way they think about architecture.
Yeah. You know, the one thing I would add is learning is really a lifelong thing. Yeah. And I think there's nothing I would have wanted to do differently as an undergraduate. I loved studying Hegel. It was great. It has nothing to do with what I do now, but it was intellectually enriching. Yeah. But now, having done the kind of work I do and really seen the way that deals are shaped and really what's going on in the tech world and what's going on in the design world these days, now I think it would be fun to go back to school again. And in particular, study, I think one of the areas of concentration that the new Cornell NYC Tech School is going to have, which is smart urban systems. I can't remember exactly what they call it, but there is some, kind of healthy communities or something like that. And I think there's so much interesting new learning about technology and data and the way that shapes the management of urban systems. So I think I'd like to go back and do that sometime in the next few years. So I think that's also something to keep in mind. That what you're studying now is going to lead you to where you are next, and then there are opportunities to study. Keep coming on in life. There are, all throughout New York City, you can, and I'm sure wherever you are in cities, you can take night classes, you can take continuing education classes, you can take a sabbatical, from your job, and take 6 months or a year of something else. And
for me, I went to law school, and obviously I'm not practicing law, and I haven't for quite a bit. And people have also asked me, do you regret going to law school? Because, it wasn't easy by any means. And then, a lot of my family members say, wow, you wasted, all those years in law school. And in fact, that's really not the case. I used to think that maybe perhaps I should have gotten an MBA instead of JD. But I view it as what you all said is they're building blocks, really. And again, that gets back to the first question is, why are we who we are today? Well, it's because of all of those experiences. It's not mutually exclusive that had I gone to business school, maybe I would have done something differently, maybe. But the fact of the matter is it's really what you do with the education, right? And what you do with the courses. And maybe substantively they're permanent, and maybe sometimes they're not directly permanent, but maybe they will be somehow, and you may not realize it until later. So I think that question is, you could answer it in many different ways, but for me, I'm glad I went to law school. I think it taught me to be extremely analytical. It taught me to be quick thinking, shifting of ideas, being challenged. Being a good communicator was also a big thing that you learn, I think, in law school because of the Socratic method. And then from there, it was just an iteration of the different position and jobs I had, and kind of liking certain parts of being a lawyer and not, and then kind of transitioning to the next role and transitioning again and again. So, yeah. So I don't think I would have changed anything, really. Maybe a few things, but. Okay, so we're talking about technology, which I think that's a fascinating, and again, I find technology and I find innovation really important in the real estate sector. And, there are a lot of things in technology. Like I find 3D printing and Google Glasses and all of that, and I read about it all the time. But there are emerging construction techniques that are very interesting. And one of which is modular housing. And I think a lot of the panelists here have, particularly Eileen, has a very keen insight into this new innovative technique. So Eileen, I would like to ask you, from a developer's perspective, how willing are the developers, willing to pursue the new innovations in construction, and tell us a little bit about this modular housing component.
Well, developers are always looking for better ways to build higher quality, build faster, less expensively, not necessarily cheaply, but less expensively. On the Atlantic Yards project, we have a master plan with 16 buildings. We finished the Barclays Center Arena. The next building is going to be a high-rise residential building, and we decided to develop it in a modular fashion. The apartments are going to be built as modules in a factory that we set up with a joint venture partner. in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. We're fabricating them now, and they're going to be shipped to the site and inserted into a steel frame starting later this summer. And it's really not revolutionary. Modular housing has been around for many years, not in a high-rise fashion, but it's been around. And modular construction has been around in the United States in ways that you might not know. For example, we do a lot of brick facade buildings. We haven't done an actual hand-laid brick building in about 20 years. All the brick buildings you see that in our portfolio have been made into panels and then hoisted them in place. The construction quality is much better. They don't leak. They're lighter, they're faster, everything is great. Curtain walls are the same way. People have been doing modular curtain wall panels that are fabricated in a factory and hoisted in place. There are fewer places to leak when you do that. And in modules themselves, prisons, there are a lot of prisons that are done in modules. There are a lot of dormitories that are done in modules. You just don't know them if they're done right. Certain buildings just lend themselves to modular design. For example, a hotel. When an architect starts designing a hotel, they say, well, the walls should be 15 feet apart. I don't know, you can correct me. So if the walls are always 15 feet apart, it's based on the size of the bed and the size of the dresser, and well, if you're going to be doing it that way on the drawing board, why can't you do it that way in a factory? What is really important is that you get a really good architect to figure out how to design it so it doesn't look like Legos, so it looks like it was meant to be that way, so the curtain walls come together and it looks like a building, not like patchwork. So it's very important to work with a good designer who understands modular systems. But modular construction is going to be the way of the future. We're going to be doing this building in about 15 months, 12 to 15 months. A typical building would be 18 to 20 months. So if you just think about 5 months that you don't have to pay a construction manager in his field office and all the hundreds of thousands of dollars, that's a savings. If you think about how the quality is so much better when you build something in a factory instead of out in the rain and the cold, that's a factor. It's going to be the way of the future, and we're really excited about it. So,
I'd like to talk about innovation in general. I think that innovation is a really interesting topic. It's certainly a front page topic these days, and I think that innovation in building is complex because it involves in New York City, and it involves sometimes code changes. It involves regulatory, the right regulatory environment. Sometimes it involves unions being able to learn new trades or learn to install things. But one of the interesting things about working internationally is a lot of the innovation people are, in this country, a lot of times we're confronted with a client who says it has to be tested. If it hasn't been done 25 times before, we're not going to do it because it's tax dollars or because it's it's money that we've raised or we can't take a risk. But one of the things we found working internationally is, particularly in Asia, people say to us, we want something that's never been done before. And that's really not something that you typically hear from a client here for a variety of reasons. And so it's really pushed us as architects by working internationally to have the ability to drive innovation. And so that's been a great process. I also think that it's interesting that new regulatory, requirements drive product innovation. Mm-hmm. For instance, like sustainability, all of the push for sustainable buildings over the last 8 years, I would say, has really driven products. I mean, there are so many sustainable products now available, so many different glass types, so many different exterior wall types that one can analyze, one can choose from, so many interior materials that come from, protected forests, that come from, or not protected forests, that come from, all different places all over the world. And there's, and then the use of computer technology and the ability for us to design something in a way that can be built built in a unique way in its form and its shape. So there's so many things that are driving technology, and I think it's a very interesting time for our profession. I think one of the newer challenges will be the question of resiliency. And as a result of Hurricane Sandy, there's a lot of discussion about resiliency, particularly in the New York region. And I think it'll be interesting to see if that somehow relates in innovative, not just buildings, but technologies and so forth, of how to do so. Right now, when we talk about making our buildings more resilient, building owners might say, well, it's going to cost X dollars more, X dollars more, X dollars more, but maybe like sustainability, maybe in a few years, you can maybe build a bathtub that could be flooded and keep your mechanical equipment in the basement and not have any risk. That'll be infiltrated by salt water, or find new systems for raising buildings or whatever. So, I think it's interesting to see the way sometimes looming disasters can force us all to innovate within our professions.
True. Hurricane Sandy was really a very interesting eye-opener in New York because, New York City always felt invulnerable to climate change before this. Climate change was an issue that affected Southeast Asian countries where, and tsunamis and other things like that. But New York is, it was like, built out to the edge of the shoreline and was really a bulwark against nature. And what Hurricane Sandy really brought home was that is not the case at all. So much attention, of course, was paid to the really devastated residential areas in New Jersey and the Rockaways, but less attention was paid to the very devastated parts of Lower Manhattan and the major office buildings in Lower Manhattan that were literally shut for months. Major corporate tenants were out of their space for months. In fact, the telecommunication system in Lower Manhattan was so devastated, it's still not all back. There are many tenants who are now back in their buildings that don't have telecom, and Verizon is using the opportunity to replace all the old copper wire now with fiber optic. But resiliency for those major landlords in those buildings is a business necessity at this point, because the tenants will not come back and lease long-term space in a building if they think there's a chance that this kind of disaster would happen again, and they'd be shut out, and they'd be out of their office space for 3 or 6 months in the future. So, it really has been interesting to watch how the upfront capital expenditure has been made, because that is really what's going to keep the value. Otherwise, the value of those buildings would drop dramatically. Right. They'd go into foreclosure, and so the landlords have determined they really have to make the capital investment.
Right.
So let's just skip ahead and talk about, there have been a lot of new large-scale developments in cities, in particular in New York, Atlantic Yards, Hudson Yards, and the live, work, play communities within cities. Do you think that it's a successful model, and do you think that it's a cyclical or secular trend, and what's your sort of experience or viewpoints on those?
I'll start on that. I think it's absolutely essential that as cities grow and that become more dense, more urban, that they're 24/7. And I think having communities that are residential and commercial and cultural is really key. And I know we've been the master planners for the new Hudson Yards project, and we're the architects of several of the buildings. And that is absolutely a mixed-use development. It has recreation, it has culture, it has business, it has retail, it has residential, and I think that's going to be the makings of a very vibrant new center in New York. And I think as Lower Manhattan has become, adding Battery Park City to what used to be literally, just closed down at 5 at night, has been a huge boon. But even still, that was so across the West Side Highway and segregated. And I think, what's happened is a lot of those old buildings, the older buildings, have been converted to residential buildings. And I know, Eileen, you've done a lot of cultural buildings downtown in Lower Manhattan, and I think that mixing is so essential for a vibrant urban lifestyle.
Completely agree.
And I think it's something that Asian cities are taking note of, actually, as they, because there's been such a push in commercial development in Asia, and now I think people are starting to...
They want a community.
They want a community. Things like the new Asia Society building in Hong Kong, and the need to develop, or the desire to develop a cultural center, and even keeping pieces of their heritage and the 12 historic districts that Shanghai has now nominated or designated. I mean, all of that, I think, is going to make for a much richer city environment and a much better lifestyle, quality of life for the people who live there.
Completely agree.
Yeah. You know, in addition to, you know, all of the you know, kind of the planning benefits and the quality of life benefits, mixed use also makes great financial sense. And if you look at many of the large-scale buildings that are being developed, I'm most familiar with New York City, so I'll use that as examples. But, you know, for example, the buildings at Hudson Yards, I'm thinking of Time Warner Center, another major mixed-use complex. What mixed use does is it basically allows you to break down what is the enormous amount of square footage that you've got to develop into several different uses. And so you're really diversifying your risk and diversifying your marketing in those. And that's very helpful on the financing end because, for example, many major buildings these days, even residential buildings, may be a mix of condominiums and rental housing. The condominiums may also have a hotel in them, so it may be a mix of hotel condominium, residential condominium, and then rental housing. The reason, I think, in fact, I'm just trying to think if that originally, I think, was for our city's plan, right? For the yeah. And the reason for that is that it allows the financing to be done in smaller chunks, separate financing for each of the different pieces, and it allows many different, you know, market forces to come in, so that you are really, you know, kind of spreading your profit opportunities and spreading your risk and diversifying your product, all of which is a very good thing, particularly when, you know, the cost of developing many new large-scale buildings is in the hundreds and hundreds of millions up to, you know, billions of dollars, or up to $1 billion. I haven't seen a building. Well, no, it's not true. The first Hudson Yards building is what? It's $1.3 billion.
I think so.
You know, you can't put all your eggs in one basket. You have to have mixed use as a financing matter.
I also think mixed use is very interesting because new things happen, like in the Time Warner Center. And also the other thing is the link to transit.
I was going to say that.
That's very key, is to make any development viable. I mean, the closer you are to transit, the better chance of success from a financial standpoint and so forth. But I think that, you know, what's interesting, like at Time Warner Center, as the first, I think, truly mixed use in that way, single complex in New York, was it has jazz at Lincoln Center, and it has, you know, commercial and hotel and residential and so forth. But the big surprise was the food market, right? And Whole Foods became, like, nobody knew that that would be such, it's become a destination.
Absolutely. Oh, it's a way of using basement space was what that was.
Who knew that? You know, so I think that when you mix uses that way, you know, new models of living actually come to life, which is, I think, a very interesting byproduct.
Do you think that this mixed-use communities have occurred because of the public-private partnerships? Because from the private equity side, there's not a whole lot of funds out there that are interested in these large-scale mixed-use development, not the ones that I've known. And so how pertinent, especially with the cost and access to capital being tight right now, is this public-private partnership, and how does that play into it?
Well, you know, I mean, what we think of as the really large-scale developments in New York City, such as the Hudson Yards project on the west side of Manhattan, the Atlantic Yards project in downtown Brooklyn, the development of Battery Park City, the redevelopment of the World Trade Center, the development of the Cornell Tech campus on Roosevelt Island.
The High Line.
The High Line.
Yeah.
Well, the High Line's actually interesting. The you know, Columbia's new Manhattanville development uptown. The Willets Point development in Queens. All of those are government-sponsored projects, and all of those are basically a way of taking underutilized, publicly owned land. You know, the great thing about being in a place like New York City, where land values are so high, is that if you can create new land by upzoning, new development opportunities, by either creating development opportunities where land had been, you know, had lain fallow, either because it was environmentally damaged, it didn't have appropriate infrastructure, it was zoned improperly. You can create and add so much value, but it takes the government to do that. And it takes the government, whether it's in the form of land assembly, As Eileen mentioned, the use of eminent domain, which was a key factor actually in being able to put the Atlantic Yards project together. That site could not be assembled privately because there was, a lot of the litigation with some famous holdout tenants who basically owned land and said, no thanks, not at any price. So, whatever you think of it, as a legal matter, as a political matter, as a philosophical matter, these large-scale projects don't get done, without government intervention of that type. Columbia also famously used eminent domain to assemble its large site in Manhattanville, and it litigated the right to use that also up to the state, the New York State's highest court, and it won. From the perspective of a real estate developer, I think that's the right result. I think that these major projects, it would be a shame to have major projects not be able to get done because of a couple of, sort of holdout landowners. And so I think that it is an appropriate use, but I recognize this is a subject of enormous political debate.
Well, Atlantic Yards is basically a private development, but it could not have been done without the state and the city. The MTA, a big chunk of the site, I think 5 acres, is a rail yard. And we had to make a deal with the Metropolitan Transportation Authority to rebuild their rail yard, rebuild some bridges for the Department of Transportation, rebuild a subway, and quite a bit of money. But we couldn't have done it unless we had that partnership. We couldn't have done it without the state to condemn a few pieces of property. And but it was driven forward by private investors, a private developer. So it was mostly private with a lot of public assistance, as opposed to a public-private
partnership.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, like for example, right now I'm looking at a project in Chelsea, and it's 10th Avenue and 24th Street. And if the High Line wasn't there, frankly, I don't know how many developers would be so interested in buying that land and building their high-end condos, because if you look at Chelsea on the west side, that High Line has brought so much, development opportunities.
But that was totally a private visionary.
Yes, it was.
That's made that happen. An individual had this idea, or several individuals together had that idea. They spent a long time trying to convince people it was a good idea.
Right.
There's no precedent for it, really.
And for a long time, people thought they were crazy.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Against many of the real estate interests, the real estate interests for a long time wanted to tear that down because it was just a blight overhead, and it, landed in the middle of their property.
So, and it took somebody in the Bloomberg administration really to recognize that this was really worthwhile and to get on board, and then the quality of the design made all the difference as well.
It did.
I mean, if it hadn't been designed and really executed in a spectacular way, and a very innovative way, and a very unique way, with a unique way to experience New York in many from different vantage points and in many different types of venues, and the programming of it. It wasn't just a beautiful park or walkway, but there are places to sit, there are places to eat, there's places to view, there's places
it was very thoughtfully designed.
It's very well designed and thoughtfully designed. That's a very good word. And that, and then in conjunction with the city upzoning and changing the zoning, that then allowed the land to become very valuable.
Yes.
Right. So it's a chicken and egg thing, right? So someone had a great idea. And often it's often a private developer or an individual who has a great idea, and it's a matter of getting other people on board and then leveraging the public and the private together that make it more than the sum of its parts.
Right. And you mentioned the zoning, and I think that's a good example of one of the things that where I think some very interesting innovation has been taking place in the Bloomberg administration is in the way they approach zoning and the value that zoning creates. And the recognition that because upzoning creates so much value, some of that should be plowed back into the public and into public goods.
Right.
And for example, the High Line zoning, the way it worked was that you got a zoning bonus on your building, but you had to quote buy development rights by making a contribution to the High Line. You had to buy them from the city. So that way, really the not the entire value, but at least the seed value of the upzoning went to the public and went then to support this public amenity, which of course turned out to be an enormous boon to private value as well. So that was a real win-win situation.
Yeah, that was actually very clever.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
That actually is also the technique that the city has used to promote affordable housing around the city. There's something called inclusionary housing in New York, and it basically allows you a zoning bonus if 20% of your units are affordable housing units, you get effectively to build 20% more space onto your buildings. That has been, and there are ways that those can move around the neighborhood, but that's actually been a huge boon to the development of affordable housing around the city, and other parks and other other public amenities as well.
I think the whole East Midtown rezoning, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but Bloomberg administration in their waning months has decided to try to push through very quickly legislation that would allow upzoning around Grand Central. And their argument is that they've made a big investment in Grand Central and improving tracks and allowing the Long Island Railroad to ultimately come into the Grand Central area, so that they've invested in the infrastructure, and now these are aging buildings. Nobody wants to rent them. The tenants, they're not state-of-the-art space. They're not sustainable buildings. They have low floor-to-floor heights. They have columns all over the place, very deep floor plates, and so they really want to allow developers to make better buildings. And one of the things they cite is all the growth in Asian cities and the link to transportation that those cities have for their Class A office buildings. And some people say, well, why do we care what anybody else is doing? You know, what is it about being globally competitive? We're New York, we don't have to be globally competitive. And so it's very interesting to hear this being played out. But at the end of the day, I mean, personally, I think the Bloomberg administration is absolutely on the right track, and that we do need to do this. We need to take our most valuable transportation hubs and make sure we have really valuable buildings there that people want to be in. But I also think one of the way the rubber's going to meet the road has to do with the investment into the public realm. And the way those deals are crafted such that the money that comes from a developer doing a very, very major building in this location will contribute in a very meaningful way to the public realm and to improving the transportation. And there's a lot of dialogue about that. And one of the challenges governmentally and that we've talked about at the AIA is the issue of the fact that from the ground plane and above is controlled by city planning, but below the ground plane is controlled by the MTA. So you have two different agencies that are not talking to each other, perhaps. And, you know, and one of the things that Asian cities have done very well is to think about the section or the depth of how you go from below grade and make that space very valuable and link it directly above grade, and you have a three-dimensional pedestrian experience. I mean, it's very clear in Hong Kong, and it's very clear in other cities with a lot of density, where they use the below grade space and it's very nice, or they have walkways up above. And so it's not something we've really done in New York, and so we're really arguing to really try to look at it that we really should have someone in charge of the public realm who looks at it more three-dimensionally.
That is interesting.
At Atlantic Yards, we don't have a real merger of below and above grade spaces, but the same thing happened with us. Everything below grade is either utilities or the railroad and subway, and above is our construction. We couldn't have done Atlantic Yards if we weren't at a transportation hub, so that's critical. We also had to contribute quite a bit. I just mentioned the railroad and the subway, but we contributed to the parks in the area, playgrounds. We're providing, eventually, as we build each building, we'll provide more public space. But another piece of infrastructure that's really important that we're going to have to contribute to is schools. Schools, we're going to be introducing a lot of children to the area if we build all of our buildings, and we're going to be building a school. In one of our buildings downtown in Manhattan, the Frank Gehry designed 8 Spruce Street, they call it now, we built a school for the city. And so that's another piece of infrastructure you can't forget about.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that is critical. I mean, in any community, you have children, and if you're going to attract families and residents, you have to think about the schools, especially in the city. I think that's a real issue.
Right.
One of the things I find different between New York and I live and work in New York, but we also have a house in Westchester County. And one of the things I find frustrating about land use issues in Westchester is that everybody's first, they don't like something, they're going to sue.
Yeah.
That's absolutely, and that is so unconstructive.
Yeah,
you know, and in New York, at least, I feel like people feel like if they have leverage, let's use the leverage to get what we want. Let's use the leverage to negotiate and get a school or get a park or get something that's an amenity rather than immediately saying, oh, I don't like this idea, let's sue. You know, and I think it's very interesting. It's a less sophisticated approach to say, oh, let's just try to stop this. But you don't really have a right to stop private owners from doing what they're allowed to do on their property.
Right.
You know, especially if it's as of right, and you don't have to get a variance. You know, so
what's the least creative?
It's the least answer. Yeah,
right.
it is.
Let's just sue them,
and you spend tons of time and lost dollars and lots of paper, and what do you get for it?
Yeah, it's true though, because a developer that I know very well, he was trying to develop the Reader's Digest parcel in Westchester, and they sued, and it just didn't go anywhere, and it was just years, and ultimately they're going to do what they were originally planning to do, you know,
because it
was so futile anyway.
Right.
So that's a good point. We would like, well, I guess I'm included in this too, is to have some behind-the-scenes stories, interesting things that have happened that either have allowed projects to occur or almost didn't happen because of certain things, or you know, some funny things that you can share with everyone here. That you know, kind of interesting little twist that happened that many people might not have known about.
Should I start?
Sure.
Yeah. The Atlantic Yards project.
Oh yeah.
The Atlantic Yards project started in 2003. We opened in September 2012, almost 10 years later. And it went through an economic collapse. It went through 2 architects. Some things that were interesting is that we had a holdout tenant in a condo who would not move. No matter how much we offered to pay him, he wouldn't move. He was the son of a very wealthy investment banker. He didn't need the money, so he just stayed. And it wasn't until the state in eminent domain took his property that we could demolish his building. But if you look at the early construction photos, the arena has 4 quadrants. 1 quadrant was not built at all. We had foundations and steel in 3 quadrants, and we had his apartment building in the 4th. So that cost us quite a bit of money. Another thing happened is that after the economic collapse, we thought, well, we can't afford to do this. We have to find new investors. Who's going to invest in 2008, 2009? Well, this Russian oligarch, who happens to be a basketball fan, just popped up. And who would have thought?
Oh, you love that.
Michael Prokhorov. And so he came in and he saved the day. We couldn't have predicted that. And then again, things were really bad in the business world in 2008, 9, 10. If you had a job, you just held on for dear life because there were no other jobs out there. Our department was reduced to less than half of what it was before. And you know, my background is in architecture. I did a little bit of construction management. One of the things we had to do is, if you look at the arena site, we had to take out 3 streets with eminent domain. And all of the utilities in those 3 streets had to be relocated. And of course, they were 100-year-old sewers and water mains. We had to replace them with new, state-of-the-art. They said, Eileen, can you do the infrastructure? I don't know anything about this, but I just, you know, it was a job. It was project management. One thing that you'll learn is that if you can manage one kind of project, you could probably manage another kind of project. There's just a certain way of organizing a team, using the right consultants and getting people to do the work and just managing them. So I managed all of the infrastructure after not having any experience in that. So that now I'm an infrastructure
Well, one thing expert. That you just mentioned, you know, when the recession hit, I think that and you just perfectly described it, is a lot of people had to reinvent themselves. And that's something that probably, it was unfamiliar to a lot of folks before the recession, right? And when 2008 occurred and the recession happened, I think a lot of people, and they were in their 40s, sometimes in their 50s, and all of a sudden, they were faced with having no job, and what do I do now, right? And so, talking about the twists and turns, and I'm one of them, by the way, right? I mean, one of the reasons why I've had such a diverse career path, when you think about it, that recession hit right in the middle of all of, I was a lawyer and then I was at Lehman for 10 years, but then after Lehman, think about all the different positions I've had. What I had to reinvent myself, frankly. And I think what Eileen, what you're saying is, within your position, when the recession hit, you had to wear different hats in order to acclimate and really just kind of pivot in your role. So.
Most of our funny behind-the-scenes stories, since you asked for funny, have to do with our clients, so I'm not sure I can really talk about them.
You don't have to name them.
But it is really fun working with different building types in different places in the world, in different parts of the country, in hot climates and cold climates, and the people and the personalities behind the projects and the cultures are so interesting and so much fun, and it's much more than work and a job. And projects are really driven by individuals.
Yes.
It's quite something. They really are driven by individuals, and you see people with vision, and you see people who see humor in different ways, and it's one of the true joys of a robust, broad practice and working on academic campuses, which I've really spent most of my life doing, and you meet such smart people. And I was thinking more about what would you have done differently academically. One of the things I think I did right was when I was here as an undergrad, I tried to take a real variety outside of architecture, because a university like Cornell, you can go really deep, but you can go really broad also. Yeah. And so, I took one course in foreign policy from Walter Lefebvre. I took astronomy from Carl Sagan. I never took wine tasting. That was a real mistake. But
I hear that's the hardest class at Cornell.
Right.
I took it.
You took it, right. But I mean, I'm just saying that all those other classes, at the end of the day, when you do a research building, you're dealing with scientists, and you're really talking about how to make a great environment for them. And when you do a hotel, you're talking about a whole different industry. And so, to the extent that you can really enjoy the range of what people do is really a wonderful aspect, and adds a lot of joy and humor to the situation.
But I mean, I think also, people, just because I do have a few technology clients too, people always, talk about Silicon, Valley, but I'm a big proponent of New York being, if not a larger presence at some point in the near future for technology. And even before all this happened, a lot of the venture capital and a lot of the startups were starting. We really were at a really quick momentum, and I think with these developments, in a few years, I really think New York is just going to it could possibly outpace, I hope.
Right.
Well, New York is a much better place to be for these young thinkers, because it's more diverse. It's not just technology like it is in Silicon Valley. It's all of the arts, all of the sciences, business, fashion.
Right.
And it's a place foreign investors like to invest.
Right. That's right.
Which also...
And I think that, the tech education and the tech businesses in New York also build on those core competencies of New York's economy. They're focusing on, kind of use of technology in financial services industries, use of technology in fashion and design, use of technology in kind of urban systems, use of technology in healthcare and medicine. So it's very much applied sciences.
Right.
So let's go to our next question. I think we're going to have a hard stop in about 15 minutes, because I think it's important for you all to ask us questions. So every industry evolves over time, and since we're all in real estate, what do you view as the major evolutionary changes that have occurred And because this is a Women in Real Estate Symposium, how has being a woman in your respective careers, how do you view that? How has that changed over the years? And also, how do you see that changing even further down the line? And, you know, do you see any major challenges coming up?
Can I say something? We had an introductory phone call several weeks ago, and we looked at a list of questions that the graduate students put together for us, and I said, you know, these are just questions about real estate. They're not questions about women in real estate, and I think that's a really important thing. You could have 4 men sitting here saying the exact same thing, and the fact that we're women really doesn't mean that much anymore. We're all very accomplished, successful, we're front runners, and it doesn't really matter anymore. So I think that's very significant.
That's a very good point.
I think it does matter. Actually, I think it's very not there yet.
True.
I am in a global firm. I've been the only woman partner for many, many years. I have 19 partners. I go to a partners meeting, and you know, we now have our second partner. She also went to Cornell, which is a good thing. But for a long time it was not that way, and so I think it's certainly you go onto a construction site or you go to the New York Building Congress events, and there's no gender balance there. So I would say, you know, it's still an issue, but I would say it's vastly different than when we graduated. Eileen and I were in the same class. In fact, we were roommates for 5 years, but when we graduated, we were 12 women out of 65. And the same year we graduated, it was the incoming class was 50-50. So we were precisely in the time frame in the mid-70s when there was a huge shift. I think 2 years ahead of us there were only 3 women. And I remember in my year the entering engineering class had 700 men and 2 women. So, and I took a class in engineering, I remember that was like hugely daunting just to like step over into that terrain. So it was, you know, it really was very different, and it felt different, and now it's much better. So I think it's, you know, I would say it's improved wholesale. There are many women on, I find as clients, many women on the other side of the table, many, you know, as you say, accomplished women in all aspects of real estate and development, but I think it's still not a 50-50 situation, and hope that someday it will be.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. It makes a difference, and it doesn't make a difference. It doesn't make a difference in the sense that you know, one can get ahead in the field just, you know, these days, luckily these days, just by being terrific and by you know, understanding, you know, kind of understanding the business, doing it well, and, you know, adding value to your clients and you know, focusing on what you're doing. But it's still remarkable because it is in many ways still a male business. It's stratified, as many businesses are. Real estate is actually many businesses, you know, kind of all tied up in the business of buildings. But there are many aspects of finance, particularly on the equity side, the private equity side, that are very male worlds.
Very.
There are, I'd say on the lending side, it's a little bit more women on the debt side. I would say, you know, among the real estate lawyers, largely still a male world. You've heard about construction and design, but it's still fun, and you still remark on it when there are a number of women in a deal, because you can get very used sometimes to being the only woman involved in something, and you know, and you notice it. You know, you notice it. You look around a room, you know, and you notice all the guys sitting around the table, and you think, where are the women? Yeah. But there's some terrific organizations that are really promoting women in real estate. In fact, I was looking at my BlackBerry on the way up here today, and the Urban Land Institute, ULI, which is a major organization for real estate development, has a whole now women's leadership initiative that they're promoting. That's one. There's a great organization in New York City called Women Executives in Real Estate, which is just a fun organization, and you realize then how many women there are in the top positions in the real estate industry. You just don't see them all on one deal. But we just actually closed the Hudson Yards deal, a deal. Jill, you talked about how long you've been working on deals. I've been working on Hudson Yards since 2002, so I guess that's 11 years. And it is, when you think about it, huge development project in New York, big construction, big money, mostly guys running it. And yet, the three lawyers who are basically who actually put together all the closings, all women. One of Related's chief engineers on the design of it, woman. And it was so much fun to see that. Everybody kind of really enjoyed, when the women got together, and and everybody, at least all the women remarked on it. So yeah, that doesn't get to innovation or change in the industry, but
no, but this is important. From the finance perspective, I will tell you, as Meredith said, it's very male-dominated. But what's interesting in this role that I'm having right now, that the current position, there's a lot of capital that pension funds and endowments and foundations and certain family offices, there's buckets of capital specifically for women-run real estate development companies or emerging fund managers. And there are a lot of chief investment officers that are women that have come to me and said, Shu, can you help us find women emerging fund managers? And I've had a real difficult time in finding women with the credibility, with the track record, with the experience, not finding women with those attributes, but actual women that are running and emerging and launching their own fund. So that made me wonder, why is that? Why can't, there's millions of dollars, billions of dollars actually, that's allocated to women, but they're having a difficult time placing that. So that was kind of an interesting,
an opportunity not being taken advantage of.
Which then I thought, well, maybe I should launch a fund if all this money's out there. But and I don't have an answer for that, really.
Well, it's the same with the WMBE situation. Public contracts and public projects all require a certain percentage of the fee go to women-owned businesses or minority-owned businesses. And it's so well-intentioned, and it has helped a lot of firms,
sure,
small firms. But what the regulations don't do is incent large firms to promote women.
Well, I think,
and therefore, I feel that because of that, women have not gotten the experience that you need to do the big projects. Mm-hmm. So therefore, if all the small firms, it's helped small firms, but it's kept them small in a way.
Interesting.
I haven't quite, this is just my own theory, so, it's a big qualification there, but I haven't, it's been on the books for a long time, and it has not resulted in large firms being able to take on major projects in a very significant way. So I think one looks at it and says, how can that be? Kind of like your situation.
Yeah.
The money's there for the taking, so how can that be,
But if you look at the stats, too, it's astounding. We're just talking about the technology and the startups, right? Do you know, I spent 3 years in New York meeting with every single VC, was very involved, and I remain still very involved, and I mentor a lot of the startups in New York. You want to talk about a male-dominated community. I could count, I think I probably found one woman founder of a technology company. And so in a way, when we're talking about emerging fund managers, it's a startup, right? You're an entrepreneur, you're launching something. So what inhibits a woman from taking all of their experience and saying, you know what, I'm going to go out there and do this on my own, And so there's a correlation, I think, of working in a structured environment, perhaps, with a platform versus going out on your own. Now, there's a lot of women small business owners, right? But when you're talking large scale, it's an interesting.
I think that you raise a really, really good and interesting question, and one thing you have to be willing to fail.
That's exactly
to start
that's
a business.
So true.
You have to be able to say, I'm going to try this. If it doesn't work, I'll go do something else. And one thing I remember noting when I was teaching was many of the women were more hesitant to raise their hand, being more concerned that they would have the wrong answer. And I think that issue that I think Sheryl Sandberg has raised about leaning in and having the confidence to say, I can do this. I don't have to know all the answers. I can figure this out. And I think anybody, and all of us, I'm sure, who have been promoted in these big companies that were at one time had more men, and we were groundbreakers in those firms, all had the confidence to say, I don't know all the answers, but I know I can figure this out and I can do it. And I think that attitude, that's the way you take on more responsibility, you learn more things, you get promoted, you meet new people, is just to say, I don't care if I've never done it before, the next guy's never done it before either. I can just I can do this.
Several years ago, we were starting a small project. It was a project that wasn't big enough for a Turner or a Tishman Construction to do, but it was too big for a small construction manager to do. And Bruce Ratner came to me and said, Eileen, you could do this. Could you be the construction manager? And I said, I thought this was the right answer. I said, I think I can do it. I might need some help, but yeah, I think I can do it. And he said to me, now that's the wrong answer. A man would never say that. A man would say, yes.
Yeah, I'll do it. Yeah.
So that's the last time I ever said that.
And he'll figure it out. Right.
And so, like when I had to take over the infrastructure, Eileen, can you do it? Yes. So, and I did it.
That's great.
That's great.
That is excellent, because that is so true.
Right.
Right. A lot of my close friends were women colleagues at Lehman. And they would often come to my office. I don't know, my office had like a revolving door. I always had people coming in and out. And they would always say to me, Shu, I don't know why, I'm not, getting this or that, the bonus, and, getting promotions and all that. And it's interesting because I think that is that fear, the fear of failure, or just saying, you know what? Maybe I don't know every single thing about this project, but just go for it. Right. Do it.
And you learn a lot. And actually, even if you screw up,
right,
you learn a lot from screwing up.
Oh yeah, you that's the most important lesson.
You learn so much when you actually don't succeed.
Right.
And maybe you do have to move to another firm. Maybe you made a big mistake. Maybe whatever. But boy, you really learn from it.
Yeah, you do. And I think one thing that I will say is, one of the things that we didn't talk about is I really feel this is a personal thing, that teaching students, even at the grade levels, the school, elementary school, well, not elementary school, but maybe high school, middle school level, to college, is the lack of classes that deal with entrepreneurialism.
Yeah.
That is so critical, I think, especially today.
Right.
And part of that is teaching young kids that failing is quite okay.
Right.
Taking the risk is okay.
Right.
As long as you learn from it. So I think that's a really good point. Well, we reached our mark. Yeah. And so thank you.
Great, thank you.
No, thank you.